perhaps the place to start is whether Allison who's done a lot of the technical work involved, would like to respond to any of Joe's comments, and then if David also wants to respond.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I'm going to take 2 points. First of all, starting with the last chart that Joe had and talking about where we see imbalances going in the future. And then I'll address the Joe's comment about including judgment makes it a bit of a black box. So first of all, on the future of imbalances, I think, as David said, we don't expect them to close rapidly going forward. Partly that's because of what he said about fiscal policy, where we don't think it would be even appropriate for countries to rapidly close those fiscal gaps. But also some of the policy gaps are structural and will take a long time to adjust. Now, coming to China, Joe is completely right. Our WEO assumption is based on a constant real exchange rate, so that pushes up the current account balance somewhat. We also assume in that projection a rather modest rebalancing going forward. An alternative scenario would be, of course, for the Chinese authority to continue what we have seen in the past, and we mentioned this in the report in terms of letting the real exchange rate rise somewhat, and then we would see a narrowing of the current account a bit. And if that was accompanied by financial reforms and capital account liberalisation, where they have been taking some steps in the recent past, that would further narrow the current account balance. So then, coming on to the second point about this being a black box exercise, what I'd like to do is step back and talk about how the IMF used to do its current account and exchange rate assessments prior to the introduction of the external balance assessment and the new external sector report, and talk about the change now. And of course, this is still very much a work in progress, and so we are looking to perfect things. So previous to the external balance assessment methodology, we had the IMF's seizure exercise, where the numbers were shown to the executive board as a group of countries, but weren't published in that manner. What happened was country teams took the estimates, decided whether it applied to their country or not, and some of them published it in the Article 4 staff reports. Well, the effects of that meant that some people took the numbers as given, others looked at 3 different estimates, perhaps averaged them and said, therefore we think everything's fine because the 3 different numbers actually averaged to 0, and other teams perhaps ignored the seizure estimates. So what we had was a sort of ad hoc approach, which meant we didn't really have consistency across the world. So I think what we've tried to do with the external sector report and the external balance assessment is have a bit more discipline internally to make sure that when we are presenting our estimates of current account gaps and exchange rate assessments, they are multilaterally consistent. So, but then we also have to recognise that panel regressions for a large group of countries inevitably are not going to give the correct answer for every single country. And we also have 3 approaches. We have the current account approach, the real exchange rate approach, and as Steve mentioned, there's also an external sustainability approach where we look at the international investment position. We also have country teams who know much more about the idiosyncrasies of their specific economies and are able to bring to the table information about, for example, the business environment in a particular country, the pension system, which may affect things, etc. And so what we've been doing is taking the EBA results as very much the starting point internally for where imbalances might be, and then discussing with the individual country teams if in their judgment they need to move off that. But if they do, then they need to have a very good reason why, and we also need to be doing that in a way that adds up across the globe. So what we do is we start with the biggest countries first and make sure that we have a very good explanation if we don't agree with the estimates. What we've also done in terms of transparency is we have been publishing the actual raw EBA data results so that people outside can compare the estimate with judgment and the raw model estimates. This year what we've also done is we've published an extra background paper which has a page setting out an explanation of each of the elements of a country's external sector position, looking not only at current accounts and exchange rates, but also at reserve accumulation and capital flows and the IIP position. So perhaps I'll leave my answers there, but I could pass.
Thank you, Alison. David, did you want to say something?
Can I have 1 minute? I'll keep it short. Joe had made the comment about the reserve norms being too high. This is an area that there is an active research agenda on this at the fund, because this is a key question for us as to how exactly we should nail these down. And certainly the methodology we have at the moment in reflecting the paper is out on the website. I mean, the basic model is one of precautionary demand for reserves. So it is designed to capture what reserve levels countries might want at times of stress, not at normal times, but at times of stress, by looking at the potential draws on foreign exchange when bad things are happening, capturing both the foreign exchange receipts, what might be happening in liabilities, what might be happening in terms of capital flight. One counter component in this also is really what do you assume in terms of the availability of additional, contingent resources. How available are automatically available are fund resources. We have a research agenda on that. How available are, for example, central bank swap lines? They affect the fact how much countries have to self-insure. So I think this is probably an issue for a completely separate section, but it is something that we are working on quite rapidly.
Yeah, and it is something people here are also working on. Joe, do you have any 1 minute reply to either Alison or Dave? We don't need to make this a ping pong match.
No, not really. I mean, we could talk afterwards about the reserve. I was referring to the regression part of the reserve norm, but it sounds like you're doing a bit more than just that. Okay.
Yeah, but even then, for us who are less expert in this world, there used to be rules of thumb of 6 months of exports or whatever, and when you start talking 50% of GDP, then that seems a little out of step with the literature, as I understand it, even for precautionary savings. But that's just me. Let me open it up to the floor. If somebody wants to go to the back mic. Do I see somebody doing that? Yes, please. Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Colin Bradford from the Brookings Institution. The thing this is a comment with a question at the end, which...
We don't do those. Could you make a question, please?
Okay. The key thing we seem to have learned from the crisis was the fact that none of us integrated sufficiently an analysis of the financial sector with macroeconomics. And it seems to me what you have here with understanding the fact that the fund has different products is you have here largely a standard macroeconomic analysis. And that probably is dictated by the fact that you have other products which do the financial part. So the question is, you have monetary policy and unconventional monetary policy in a box on page 11. I haven't read the whole paper, but I flipped through it quickly. There's a question of, would it help to show the capital account and its potential divergence from the current account numbers? Would that reveal anything about the intrusion of financial exogenous variables into upsetting the standard macro analysis? So that the bottom line question I have is, knowing that Brookings, we had an IMF staff doing on Monday a week ago.
Could you get to the question?
Macro prudential piece of this. So the question is there a product? What product at the fund integrates, corrects the fact that we didn't previously integrate the financial sector analysis with the macro? That's the question.
Okay, yeah, I mean, as you say, we have many products. I mean, the ESR is intended to be relative to kind of some medium-term norms, right? It is not focused on the short-term risks or the short-term macro components. In terms of what we have that integrates those, I guess there are 3 products we do on a regular basis that are all published, and new rounds will be coming out very shortly. We have, obviously, the World Economic Outlook, which has a large component now highlighting the risks and how those become integrated. We have a separate report, the Global Financial Stability Report, which is also done, there are large editions every 6 months. There's also a quarterly update, which looks exactly at the integration of the financial and how it translates across. And we also, every year now, have produced spillover reports, which try to pull out how policies in one country translate into impacts on others, try to integrate those together to capture the cross-border. So, I mean, there are a variety of products. They're all up on the website, and hopefully we are, yes, I mean, we fully accept that the need to pull in the financial variables into some of our standard macro was clearly an issue, and I think we have responded.
Anyone else have a question? Yes, please.
Ernie Prieg, Manufacturers Alliance, and my question relates to my reaction that the presentation has been sort of a presentation of Hamlet without the Danish prince. Because when it comes to norms, as I understand the IMF Article 4 in particular, the central norm should be market-based exchange rates, which haven't been referenced at all today. That's what Article 4 is all about, that we negotiated in the 70s, related to you shouldn't manipulate your currencies. Shouldn't, my question, particularly for big industrialized trading nations, shouldn't the central norm be market-based exchange rates?
Well,
I can take it if you want.
sure.
Well, let me explain. Let me respond from our EBA models perspective. As essentially, and then maybe David can go a little deeper. But what I'd like to say is, if every country in the world had a market-based exchange rate, by which I think you mean a perfectly floating exchange rate regime, the big question is, would we still need to do our analysis? And our answer would be yes, because there's all sorts of policy distortions that have nothing to do with the foreign exchange market that can nevertheless show up in current account distortions and exchange rate distortions. So a too loose fiscal policy will have a spillover effect and distort the current account and the exchange rate. An inadequate social protection network will do that. Also, capital controls that stop capital from flowing from a developed country to a country with a higher return on investment. Those will distort things. So we'd still be in business, and it would still be important for us to do this exercise, even if every country did no FX intervention at all. So I think we could never define the norm entirely on simply observing whether countries were doing FX intervention or not. Now, that said, we do recognize that FX intervention can have distortionary effects, and we've tried to say in some cases where we think there's been too much FX intervention beyond what would be necessary for reserve adequacy, and we've tried to estimate those effects. So it's part of the picture, but I wouldn't quite put it at the center of the picture.
Joe, do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, except I would agree with what Steve said. Even if we had perfectly floating exchange rates, we would still want to do this exercise because other policies matter. And I would add, I've become rather a disbeliever in the efficiency of markets, and so I would hold out that even if countries didn't intervene, markets might get their exchange rates wrong sometimes too.
Sounds reasonable.
Ian Talley, The Wall Street Journal.
Yep.
It is my understanding that one of the mandates underlying the IMF is to ensure that its members do not manipulate their exchange rates for competitive advantage. to what extent does this report or your analysis help to support that mandate? It seems to me that it, and I'm not an economist, but it seems to skirt around the issues in so many careful ways that it avoids having to press its members on that mandate. Can challenge me on that assumption.
Yeah, challenge.
Challenge. Yes, the currency manipulation, and as you rightly say, the Articles of Agreement do provide that one of the obligations of member countries is that they do not manipulate their exchange rate for a competitive advantage.
We can't hear you.
So, yeah, as was stated, I mean, the Fund's Articles of Agreement, part of, I guess, Article 4, is that member countries do not manipulate their exchange rate to obtain a competitive advantage. This was, I guess, the source of a lot of discussion back in 2006, 2007, and one of the issues what we had was what exactly does that mean? How do you convey that? How do you make those assessments? And in 2007, there was a new bilateral surveillance decision, which tried to put some meat on that as to kind of try to set the frameworks for how we might make those assessments. And certainly, those assessments are done. We now do much broader external sector assessments. I mean, along the lines that Steve said, we go way beyond just looking at the exchange rate, whether there's a market, whether the exchange rate is floating, to look at all kinds of external sector policies. The issue, of course, is that there are circumstances in which countries should intervene and would be recommended to intervene. For example, to avoid a lot of short-term volatility. In terms of where we go, I mean, those discussions do take place in the individual country Article 4 discussions. But as you know, I mean, as yet, no member country has been found to be in breach of those obligations. But certainly, the framework is there. The discussions take place. The assessments we have done, the frameworks, the models we use here are used as part of those discussions to try to work out where policies are and where the external assessments is.
I think David has given a very fair answer of the state of play. I think Ian obviously asked a very pertinent question. Just to, as always, I have to advertise some of our work. Many of the people in this room will recall that we had a sort of half-day conference about 4 or 5 months ago on the issue of currency manipulation, which Joe contributed. Some counterparts from the IMF had also contributed, people from Brazil, from Canada, and probably we will link to that as well on the webpage from today's event, where we've been discussing those issues, and we continue to consider those issues, which are now becoming pertinent again in recent trade discussions in the U.S. Please.
Brad Setzer, U.S. Treasury.
You're like Jacob, you're too tall for the mic, so please just pull the mic out. Thank you.
Brad Setzer, U.S. Treasury. 2 questions. The first question is that you identified excessively loose fiscal policy as one of the distortions. I wondered if the fund has found any concrete examples of the opposite, cases where excessively tight fiscal policy have contributed to large current account surpluses. Perhaps a country like Korea, which last I noted still has a significant surplus in its general government fiscal balance. So question 1 is, are there any cases of that character? Question number 2, when I looked back at the actual impact of reserve accumulation in the fund model, taking into account the identified gaps in capital controls and the identified or an estimated of what kind of reserve accumulation would have been judged appropriate on reasonable assumptions, the estimated impact of intervention is roughly 0.10. Also, 100 billion in intervention produces on average a $10 billion change in the current account surplus. Joe's coefficients, if I understand them correctly, would have produced an estimate of 0.6 to 0.1, or 100 billion produces a 60 to 100 billion dollar impact on the current account. The question is, how can such a large discrepancy be explained? What concrete judgments have you made that differ from the concrete judgments that Joe made to come up with such a large difference, much smaller estimate of the impact. And to be real, concrete, in the Gagnon model, if I understand it correctly, there would have essentially been no rise in the emerging economy's aggregate current account surplus in the period from 2003 to 2007, where in the funds model, there would have been a quite significant rise. So there's a meaningful gap, and I'm wondering concretely what explains the very wide variation between the two.
Let me direct traffic a moment. It's if my colleagues from the fund will allow me, it's a little unfair to put them on the spot. Your question is entirely legitimate, Brad, of course. But it's a little unfair to put them on the spot because they were not the ones working on that particular subject. So I would suggest that maybe Joe tries to answer objectively about what were the points of difference between the IMF and his studies, because I know he's been in constant dialogue with them, and then if some of the IMF people want to come in, they can. But Joe first.
We wouldn't mind answering also if we have a chance.
That's fine. I just said you will, but I just was trying to be nice to you. If you'd rather go first, you can. Joe.
Oh, okay. It's a technical question, and this is, I don't know,
Get a little technical, Joe.
All right. So for those of you who know statistics, there's the question of simultaneity, that all these variables affect each other, and we're trying to isolate one causal chain of relationships out of several, and that is a problem. It boils down to what's called instrumental variables. What instruments do you use is a big part of it. I believe you can't use things that are correlated with trade or finance. And at least one of the variables you guys use is U.S. interest rate, which I would say would not be a legitimate instrument. And so what you need is things that are correlated with why a country might want to hold reserves for their own sake. So, war chest or store value for future generations, those things. And when you use that, you tend to get bigger effects. The other things are the effective intervention probably takes time to build. When you go in and intervene in the market, of necessity, the first thing that moves must be you're buying from some private agent somewhere, and it's only as the exchange rate moves that the current account can then adjust. So when you look at estimates over longer periods, you get bigger effects, and I do. Those are two of the biggies. I think another one has to do with one of the variables in the EBA regression is the lagged position of foreign assets that a country owns. But a huge chunk of that for some countries, most of that for some countries, is actually the lagged stock of reserves they already hold. So what you're getting is the lagged effect of your own intervention is considered to be something else, and it's not considered to be the effective intervention. I think that's sort of putting part of the effect somewhere else in the regression and not recognizing it actually is. So these are three examples.
No, I think that was admirably clear. Thank you, Joe. So 3 areas: the inclusion of instruments, multiple instruments, which ones you leave out. If you have fewer instruments, you'll tend to have a bigger effect for the instruments that remain. The issue of the time period of which you expect these effects to come about. And then the question of how you interpret the preceding stock of assets, since it has some effect, but it's not necessarily independent. I think that was admirably clear. Steve, you wanted to come in, please.
Sure. It was admirably clear, and I won't try to rebut those points. I just want to make a couple additional points. There is a real question of simultaneity here, of a very difficult problem of trying to say what is the effect of one given policy if everything else were unchanged. And that's a very abstract, academic, natural question to ask. But in the real world, we see bundles of policies. So to take a most prominent example, in China there had been, or there still has been, very large FX accumulation. There had also been capital controls. There had also been very low social safety nets. In Norway, there's very large oil or hydrocarbon exports that are owned by the governments. All those things are there, and at the same time, as Joe points out, there's been large accumulation in such countries of what he calls net official flows. It's very difficult to imagine changing one of those things without the other. Those things tend to interact. In fact, in our analysis, we can't even find an effect of FX intervention by itself. We find it only in cases where capital controls are present. In fact, in our tables, it's very difficult for us to say what's the contribution of FX intervention and what's the contribution of capital controls in the best moments. And I think this is the way the ESR does it. We add them together, reflecting that difficulty. I think that's a big part of the story. Is there's a danger, to put it simply, there's a danger of double counting or of over-explaining current accounts. If, for example, it looks like China's current account surplus in the past was completely explained by FX intervention or official flows, as one of Joe's charts might have suggested, then that seems to leave no role for anything else. So I think part of the answer has to do with the difficulty of the problem, and some of it has to do that we've got more variables and more policies in our regression. Now, it may not be I'm not accusing Joe of omitted variable bias, but it may be the case that it's hard to say whether it's the health expenditure, what's causing what exactly. It's macro.
Again, Stephen, sincere thanks, because that was also admirably clear, and it's okay to accuse our people of omitted variable bias. It may not be right, but it's a legitimate thing. I don't want to lose Brad's other question, though, because I think it was very important. He mentioned Korea as an example of a country that may be pursuing a highly tight fiscal policy, and that has some influence on its current account. Germany, a number of us would also cite in a similar regard. I don't know if one of the IMF colleagues would like to comment on that question at all.
I'll do it a bit. It's an observation that when it comes to fiscal policy gaps, the tradition, the likely direction that the IMF will find them in is that the policy is too loose. So that's been the old. It's mostly fiscal for nickname for the IMF for many years. Now certainly that's not the case when we're talking about short-run fiscal policy. At least since 2008, there have been plenty of cases where the IMF was suggesting that a country is being too tight or is failing to loosen fiscal policy appropriately. But I know what Brad's thinking. He's thinking that the norms are really about medium-term norms. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're using in our analysis, and he's right. So I'll anticipate that rebuttal, and I'll have to say, look, yes, if you look at the gaps identified for the countries in these charts that we show, it is almost, if there's a gap, a fiscal policy gap, it's almost always in that direction. And if there are some cases that have been in the other direction, but to be fair, they have not been as large. So it has not been the case, as far as I'm aware of, in recent years, that the fund has told a country that over the medium term it should drastically loosen its fiscal policy. But that's just what I'm aware of. It's possible, but of course, from a sustainability or a crisis prevention point of view, that's not going to be the motivation for it. It's going to be a more subtle motivation about, say, intergenerational equity or removing some kind of distortion. So you can imagine that it must be more difficult for the IMF to come up with those kinds of recommendations to loosen fiscal policy structurally. But I do know cases, I won't go into, where those discussions are happening, where the issue is on the table, and we'll see from year to year in every country's Article 4 staff report whether we can point to a particular example where a country was told it should do a major loosening of fiscal policy.
Sorry, can I just want to push you 1 second on this. You and your colleagues have been gracious enough to present the external sector report here today. There is another report that the fund has been doing, the Spillovers report, that is obviously closely related but distinct. My sense was that in such cases as Korea and Germany, there is actually an external spillover from their fiscal policies being too tight. And you made a perfectly sound answer, and you were very frank about where the fund is coming from, but you were citing only domestic reasons to critique a fiscal policy. Doesn't the Spillovers report at least think about the fact that somebody might be causing problems by having too tight a fiscal policy for others?
Maybe if I can take that, and I hope this is the time when I should have a lawyer with me. The fund a couple of years ago introduced the integrated surveillance decision, which was designed to look at exactly this issue. One country's policies have impact on others. We're in an integrated world economy. Those effects, the cross-border effects, can be very large. Right? The spillover analysis, sets the framework. does the math, looks at a whole bunch of models of how we can capture those things. But certainly those discussions of the impacts on third countries are now part of Article 4 discussions. The Article 4 discussion with a Germany or a Korea will discuss those issues. What is the outward impact of your policies? So yes, those are part of the discussions, and you should see them coming up in individual country Article 4s.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask our last two questions to be grouped, so because we're coming close to witching hour. It's been a very rich discussion, and I hope that my little bits of pushing here or there have led to good results. I think we've heard some very interesting things. Jo Marie in front, please give her the mic, and then Bill in back with our last two questions.
Thank you. Jo Marie, grease grabber with New Rules for Global Finance. And I wanted to tease out one of those single factors of causality, namely the correlation between public health and current account imbalances. And could you please apply that to a current issue in the United States, the Obamacare, and how it might affect our current account balance?
Maybe Joe wants to say that and not the other people. But while you decide if any of you are going to answer that, Bill, please identify yourself. What's your question?
My question is whether...
That's Bill Klein from the Institute.
I'm sorry, Bill Klein from the Institute. Whether the fund has excessive elasticity pessimism. Last year when the Japanese yen plunged, the projection of Japan's current account surplus 5 years out in the spring wheel barely budged. So those of us who do equilibrium analyses had to make our own estimate for Japan. We have now had a 12% real effective depreciation for Brazil, India, and Turkey from April to September. And I wonder whether we will see the same thing, that despite this huge move, there will be little change in their current account projections in the out years, and therefore will have problems interpreting the policy implications. I wonder if you could comment about what seems to be excessive elasticity pessimism at the fund in regard to the findings of the EBA analysis and where this might be going.
Two very good questions. Is anyone willing to tackle Jo Marie's?
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
So I can't exactly answer your question because I'm not an expert on the extent to which Obamacare will increase or decrease public spending on health in the U.S. as opposed to total spending or what it will do. But someone who I won't name asked me, a smart economist in town here in a high position, asked me to, is this result driven, this public health expenditure result driven by the U.S.? We have a big current account deficit, we have a lot of public health spending. Is that why we're getting that result? Well, not at all. It's a very robust result, so it's quite interesting. I think it could apply to China. I don't know the answer about Obamacare. And then, I'm sorry I couldn't answer you more, and then if I could just, a little interjection to spur my colleagues on the other question, and this is something I mentioned in my talk in response to Bill. It seems to me, but this is only a casual impression, that the IMF has a tendency to be hesitant to forecast big movements and imbalances in the future. And would you disagree with that, or how do you feel that? And that's my gut feeling from looking at past forecasts, is that you kind of want to draw straight lines always.
Very good. So we'll let our colleagues from the fund respond to Bill, and that will be our substantive closing.
That was the elasticity pessimism
Yes.
question.
Are you guys elasticity pessimists, or as Joe indicates, are you volatility fearers?
No, I think what's happening is that more than one thing is happening at the same time. That's life. So it may be that for some countries elasticities are thought to be lower than for others, or the size of the traded goods sector is lower, and I can't speak to the implicit elasticity assumption that's behind every team's projection of the trade balance or the current account. But what I'm sure of is that they're looking at more than something else happening at the same time. So, for example, take a recent example, exchange rates may have moved in as part of a tightening of global financial conditions related to expected tightening of U.S. monetary policy, or exchange rates might have moved, Japan's exchange rate might have moved in response to a change in the monetary policy regime or the announced monetary policy going forward. And those changes themselves are taken account of in the IMF team's current account and trade balance forecasts. And they'll often be, the effects of those changes that are happening at the same time of the exchange rate will often be in the opposite direction. So it's not that there is a zero elasticity or a small elasticity necessarily, it's that you're not seeing kind of the two effects broken out. Basically, we're talking about, say, what used to be called expenditure reducing and expenditure switching, or expenditure enhancing and expenditure switching, those two effects happening at the same time. I think that's the main reason.
That's excellent. Ted Truman has invoked the dreaded two fingers.
Well,
Something quick.
Well, Allison commented a bit on this. So one question is whether Bill's question could be answered by looking at sort of the raw results, if you want to put it that way, that come out of the model from your, as you say, is on your website, and sort of the results that come out of the country. So in some sense, that's what you're observing, it seems to me, or Bill seems to be observing. You're seeing the model result that comes out in some sense, and then you have the massaging and the back and forth with respect to the country team. I may be wrong in interpreting that way, but that's how I interpret it. Is that correct or right?
Maybe I should take that one. I mean, yes, we run the models, we get the results. With every model, there is a residual. In some cases, with no offense to Steve, but some cases those residuals are big. In some cases, he does a very good job, but some cases, there are issues. We have to look at this. And part is because we are applying, a standard panel across, for even-handedness. It has to be that way. And there are some countries where there are special factors at work that really have to be accounted with to really understand that. And so, what the massaging is an attempt to reflect those special factors. It's not an attempt just to push everything back to where it is. We really do, try to pull in all the information we have. I know Steve hates me for saying this, but now we have the models up there. You can all run those models. I think everyone in this room probably has an RA who can run this model. You can generate those forecasts. You can do it again for next year. But where obviously the fund also has the interactions with the country authorities. We have to be able to reflect that information in some way. We know it comes across as a black box, and we know it sets us a very open to this question of is it just massaging? No, it's not massaging with a motive. It's a massaging to try to reflect the information we have.
Excellent. I want to thank everyone, but I want to particularly thank David, Steve, and Allison. I think David's last answer just shows the level of serious engagement which his team, his colleagues, the fund are taking on this combined challenge of trying to put out their new products that are analytically sound, that are transparent, and that are addressing some of the key issues. And they may ultimately get shot at both on technical grounds and political grounds, but I give them enormous credit that I think this report in particular, but also many of the things the fund has been doing in the last couple of years have been extremely constructive progress in that direction. We are very grateful to them for sharing it with us today and discussing it in such frank, open terms and substantive terms. Grateful to Joe Gagnon for his contribution in drawing out some of that, and to all of you for stimulating the discussion. We look forward to more events of this kind. We have a very active program coming up, free riding on the excitement of the annual Fund Bank meetings, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.